I had one comment that said, the New Testament is worthless as history. What's not historical about the New Testament? We have his birth, we have his life, he was a teacher and a healer. We have his teaching, remarkable as it is. We have his death by crucifixion, and we have the strong belief that he was raised from the dead. Gary Habermas, probably the foremost genuine scholar concerning the resurrection of Christ. What he did was take 3,500 historians, collected the historical facts surrounding the death of Jesus, only the facts that they all agreed on. But the point is, virtually all agree that the basic history of the New Testament is true. So you have about 70% consensus about the empty tomb, but you've got 90 plus with everything else, that the disciples were genuine in their faith. They really believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. Hey, welcome to Church for Skeptics. We're going to talk about the history of the New Testament, or the New Testament as history. And I've been doing this for a while now and talking about this very topic. Eventually we'll go to something else, but there's just so much information here. What's wrong with the history of the New Testament? I've gotten a lot of comments, of course, most of them negative. I get a few positive ones. And I appreciate the fact they're willing to take the time and watch the video, if they do, and comment, even if it's against me, because it makes me do my homework as well. I do look at the comments. Sometimes I will respond directly to them, but I've done a lot of research as a result of that too. And I still want to ask the question, what's wrong with the New Testament? And something came up that is puzzling to me. I had one comment that said, the New Testament, this is what the comment said, the New Testament is worthless as history. And his number one reason to think that, or to say that, is that he thinks the New Testament is anonymous, or at least the Gospels are anonymous. So if we don't know who wrote them, then they can't be historically accurate. And I said in the last video, that's a non sequitur. Even if we didn't, I think we do know who wrote the New Testament and wrote the Gospels themselves. Even if we did know that, it wouldn't preclude them from being eyewitness testimony. I'll read you this. Luke chapter 1, verse 1 through, we use this a lot, of course, so do a lot of apologists. And you're not going to make up the name Luke as a gospel writer, because the whole point of, and we'll get to this too, the whole point of all this is to get to apostolic authority. That's the bottom line for the New Testament, period. So Luke is not an apostle. Why in the world would you assign his name wrongly or incorrectly or on purpose, unless it was true? And here's what Luke says. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us. Now watch this. By those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. You know, sometimes the way we think about things, or the way we write things or use the words, aren't the same as them. Luke here is referring to the apostles themselves. The apostles were the eyewitnesses who were there from the first. That was the credential for being an apostle. And I want to do a video specifically about that, but I just wanted you to point that out. Now, as far as his history, here's my first contention, I guess. In the fifth, I'm in Luke 3. Now, I've used this before, and I'm not going to milk this like I have before, but there are tons of historical references here, and they're falsifiable. In other words, there are other histories. These are the kind of histories that would show up in other documents that are not biblical. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caius, the word of God came to John of Zechariah in the wilderness. There's only one historical contention or position here that anybody attacks, and it's the one where Lysanias is called here the Tetrarch of Abilene during the time of when John the Baptist had his ministry. Well, there was a Lysanias who was also a tetrarch who died in 40, or I think it was 36 BC. And so that can't be the same guy. And so critics have gone after that, and Luke's off his rocker. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a bad historian. Until they found an inscription that said there was another Lysanias who was guarding the august lords, which would be Tiberius and his wife. And so most archaeologists and most historians would concede now that there was another one, and Luke is right on target here. My point is this: these are all historical things. When I listen to or write or read the documents from guys like Bart Ehrman, they don't really have a contention about any of this general history. When they say the New Testament is not historical, what they mean is it has contradictions internally, and almost all those contradictions are minute details. A lot of them have to do with the exact time and place and of Jesus' birth, who was Joseph's father, and when the two genealogies. And these are I mean, they're historical, I guess you'd say. So, but they're not what we would call generally history. And my point here is this: that if we can reconcile those little discrepancies here, the general flow of the New Testament is exceptionally historical. As a matter of fact, let me give you, and you probably know this, there's a guy, the leading archaeologist, the absolute expert for ancient history in Asia Minor, was a guy named Sir William Ramsey, a British archaeologist and historian. He died in 1939, so it's been a while. But here's what he says, and just because he's old doesn't mean that he's dumb. This guy was a real scholar. That's why he was knighted. He said when he first started his archaeological quests, he thought of the New Testament as being bogus. He said, I was disposed against it. But the more that I went and the more I looked, he said, the more I realized how accurate the New Testament is. As a matter of fact, here's what he says about Luke. He says Luke is an historian of the first rank, one of the great historians of all time. At the end of his life, Sir William Ramsey said by his own testimony that he had become a Christian. And I realize Christians come and go like that, and we like to laud those who have become Christians, and the skeptics like to laud the ones who say they quit believing. I understand that. But this guy did, and it was precisely because his journey was Luke as an historian. So when you say the New Testament is absolutely bogus when it comes to history, I don't know how you get that. I just don't know how you get that. And according to this guy who gave the comment, the reason he thought it was bogus history is because we don't know the authors of the New Testament. Well, I think we do know the authors of the New Testament. But irregardless of that, you look at William Ramsey, and here's why he says this, by the way. Luke names 32, this is in Luke and Acts, mostly Acts. He names 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 islands, and all of the correct names and titles and magistrates and so forth, tetrarchs. He gets them all perfect. I mean, really, he does. He gets them all the way from Gallio being the proconsul of Achaia, where Corinth was, and a guy named Publius being called the first man of the island. And all those things, they are externally corroborated. And Luke gets them all right. I don't see how you can say it's not history. So my point is here, when skeptics like Bart Ehrman say that the New Testament is not historical, he starts with the same thing. We have anonymous authorship of the Gospels, and then he says you have all these discrepancies between them. We'll get to that, of course. There's only one actual historical event that I think they have contention with, and that we do have to deal with, and that is the census under Caesar. of course, that's, in Jesus' birth, they said that Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem because of that census. And you have to dig to find out how that works historically. Other than that, there's these minute things. And they're not really historical errors. They're just, he would call them, we would call them alleged contradictions and discrepancies between the Gospels. What do other ancient historians say about the general flow of Jesus? Here's what I'm going to come back to at the end. When I say that the New Testament is historical, it's obvious that it is. What's the big picture here? That Jesus was a person, that he was a first century Jewish rabbi, that he stood in the place of God, speaking from the authority of God. He was crucified. He was arrested by the popular Jewish leadership because of blaspheming. The Romans didn't care much about that, so they had to portray Jesus as claiming to be a king, which the Messiah would be. He rode into Jerusalem as a king. Those are historical facts. Nobody disagrees with those things, so I don't see how you can say that the New Testament is bogus as history. It has nothing to say about history. That he was crucified under Pontius Pilate is an historical fact. Let me just give you some historians and what they say. Now, sometimes you have to read between, that's what historians do. You read between the lines and you think, if this is true, then this has to be true too. I'm going to give you 4 or 5. I'm going to start with a guy named Suetonius. Suetonius was a Roman historian. He wrote the life of the Caesars in 120 AD, and he doesn't say much about Jesus, but here's what he does say. He says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, Claudius expelled them from Rome. By the way, you can get that same information from the book of Acts. I think it's chapter 11, verse 26. And we're not going to go there, but if you want to check it out, it's there. So now we come to another guy. His name is Lucian of Samaria. All we can say for this first guy is that he goes on to say Jesus was crucified, but then he talks about the Jews, the emperor Claudius expelling the Jews because of Christ. All those things are historically true, and they're also verified in the New Testament. Lucian of Samaria was a Greek satirist. He wrote in the second half of the 2nd century, so he's talking about 150 AD forward. And here's what he said. He's talking about Jesus as, quote, that one whom they still worship today, the man in Palestine who was crucified because he brought this new form of initiation into the world. Next guy is a guy named Phalus. Now he's earlier than these guys, but we don't have his works. The reason we know him is because he was quoted, and somebody used his quotes. And this other guy here named Cincillus is writing about what Phalus said. Now, we don't have Phallus's documents, but obviously he did. Phalus was writing in 55 AD. That's pretty remarkable right there. And in his writings, Phalus mentioned the darkness over the whole land that, of course, is testified in the New Testament during the crucifixion of Jesus. There was darkness over the land for 3 hours. Phalus ascribed that darkness to an eclipse. Cincillus, writing later, says, here's what he writes. In the 3rd book of Phallus's history, he calls this darkness an eclipse of the sun. And he then says, wrongly, in my opinion. And by the way, he was wrong about that. My point is that you've got these historians that just assume that Jesus was a real person and that he was crucified under Pilate and that there was darkness over the land during that time. Here's my favorite guy here, a guy named Marabar Serapion. He's writing somewhere after 70 AD, so it's pretty early. He's a Syrian philosopher who got himself in jail because of his philosophy. They did that a lot in those days. and he's writing to his son from prison. And what he's saying is that it's foolish to persecute wise people. And I'm sure he's referring to himself as well. But let me read you what he writes here to his son. What good did it do to the Athenians to kill Socrates, for which deed they were punished with famine and pestilence? What did it avail the Samaeans to burn Pythagoras, since their country was entirely buried under sand in one moment? Now here's the point. Or what did it avail the Jews to kill their wise king, since their kingdom was taken away from them from that time on? God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of famine, the Samians were flooded by the sea, the Jews were driven from their kingdom everywhere, living in the dispersion. And of course, that's exactly what happened in 70 AD. That's a seminal date, and we're gonna talk about things surrounding that one way or the other in future episodes here. Two more. Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman historian. He lived from 56 AD, so he was born, 30 years after Jesus. He lived till 120 AD, and he wrote something called the Annals, which were about the Caesars, from Augustus Caesar, not the first Caesar, but the first one who called himself deity, all the way to Nero. He would have been, in the 60s AD. And so here's what he writes about Jesus. What he's writing here is about the fire that Nero set himself in Rome. Most historians, even across the stripes, would believe that and understand that. So obviously Tacitus does too. Now keep in mind, he's writing about 100 AD. Therefore, to squelch the rumor that Nero set the fire, Nero created scapegoats and subjected them to the most refined tortures to those who the common people call Christians, hated for their abominable crimes. What abominable crimes? Well, we don't have another video for that. Basically, I'll just tell you, they called them cannibals because they had took the Eucharist, and they were atheists because they rejected all the Roman gods. They were hated for their abominable crimes. Their name comes from Christ, who during the reign of Tiberius had been executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate. One more, Jewish historian Josephus. In his book, Antiquities, there are a couple things I want to mention here, that because Josephus kind of hones in a little more. Of course, he's Jewish, and he's in Palestine, grew up as a son of a rabbi in Jerusalem. Here's what he says about a particular high priest. His name was Ananus, and Josephus is not fond of him. He says he was a bold man in his temper and very insolent, speaking of the high priest, Ananus. And he was also of the sect of the Sadducees. Interesting, Josephus' father was a Pharisee, who are very rigid in judging offenders above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When therefore Ananus was of this disposition, even though he now had a proper opportunity to exercise his authority, Festus, the king, was now dead, and Abanus was but upon the road, the next one. So he assembled the Sanhedrin, the ruling judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. He delivered them to be stoned. So here's an historical. By the way, the New Testament doesn't talk about the execution of James. Josephus does. Josephus is not a Christian, of course. But the point is here that James is the brother of Jesus. Biblically, we know that's true. And most would say he's the first New Testament writer, that the book of James is the earliest New Testament epistle. Going on about Josephus, though, here's what he says. At this time, and by the way, I've taken out what they think Christians edited in about Jesus being a little more than Josephus thought he was. So I've edited those out. So this is just the bare bones of what Josephus said, that most editors, most historians would agree this is there. This is actually Josephus saying, "At this time there appeared also Jesus. He was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure, and he gained a following, both among many Jews and among many of the Greek origin. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so, and up until this day the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out." How is it that the New Testament has no historical value, according to that guy's comment? I don't understand that at all. There's there's just no reason. As I said, even the worst critics here, they don't really go after the real history of the New Testament, the Luke stuff, the big picture stuff. They go after the details between the Gospels. They can't both be right. Let me give you one last guy here, and I would encourage you, I know this guy. Gary Habermas is a great, probably the foremost genuine scholar concerning the resurrection of Christ. He has written tons of stuff, more stuff than you'll ever want to read about the resurrection. And he got his doctorate degree at the University of Michigan State University. And his doctorate at Michigan State, I think his degree was in philosophy, but his doctorate was on the resurrection at a secular university. But what he did was take 3,500, now get this, 3,500 historians from across the stripes, Christians, non-Christians, Jews, non-Jews, Americans, British, Germans, French. He got 3,500 and only collected the historical facts surrounding the death of Jesus, only the facts that they all agreed on. He calls that the minimal facts, and he adjusts them occasionally as the years have gone by. But the point is, virtually all agree that the basic history of the New Testament is true. That Jesus of Nazareth lived in the first century Palestine as an itinerant rabbi, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate in 30 or 33, depending on which one you think is the better date. That has to do with making sure that the Passover and the moon and Friday all coincide, 30 or 33. And you're talking about 95% agreement here. When it comes to the empty tomb, that Jesus was, most historians believe Jesus was buried. There are a few who don't, but most do because of two reasons. One is Jewish practices, Jewish customs. You had to bury the dead before nightfall, or the whole land would be defiled. The Romans, and this is from Josephus as well. The Romans allowed that. And then the other factor that causes most historians to believe that the tomb was empty was, we called it in an earlier episode, the Jerusalem factor. This was a public event. No, Christianity couldn't have gotten off of the ground without an empty tomb. And so you have about 70% consensus about the empty tomb, but you've got 90 plus with everything else. 90% consensus about from the whole bunch of them, 3,500 plus, that the disciples were genuine in their faith. They really believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. You can't account for it anyway. You might still think they were wrong about that, but you can't really reasonably be wrong about the fact that they believed it. And then there's another factor here that most skeptics would agree with as well, and that is the conversion of two former skeptics, James, the brother of Christ, and Paul, the persecutor of Christians. I'm going to add three more and then be done. Historical facts about Jesus. He was a remarkable teacher. And we've done a video, I think, on that, but you start listing the things that Jesus said that we still talk about even if we're not Christians. Stuff like go the second mile, who cast the first stone, judge not that you be not judged. All those are from Jesus. He was a remarkable teacher. He was also a miracle worker. Even Josephus talks about startling deeds. We think people were dumb back in those days, and we think that there must have been lots of miracle workers back then. But the truth is, I couldn't find any. Maybe a one-off guy who prayed and something happened, but nothing like the miracles that Jesus did. So you got even enemies saying he's a sorcerer. All of his marvelous deeds are from the devil. And then most historians would agree that they, back in the day, and historians of that day thought there was something unusual about the death of Jesus. The Greek satirist Lucian, he thinks that Jesus' mother was an adulteress. So it's something unusual about his birth there. Those are just kind of historical things. So the final point of this video is this. What's not historical about the New Testament? We have his birth, that he was born. We have his life. He was a teacher and a healer. We have his teaching, remarkable as it is. We have his death by crucifixion, and we have the strong belief that he was raised from the dead. That's Christianity. How is that not historical as well? Thanks for watching.